Um, my name's David, and I'm the MC for the evening. So the Bay ALN's been around since 2006. We've met every month except once when the venue actually got sold out from under the company that loaned it to us. So that was annoying. Many of us actually met in a local bar, but it didn't really count as a meeting at that point. So basically, we just finished the networking part of our agenda. For those of you who didn't hear about it, there's people looking for work and work looking for people over there. Fill that out if you're looking for work or looking for people. And I generally take a picture of that and post it on the Meetup site. Then we're going to wrap up around 8:50, and we have a raffle, and that's really a ploy to make sure that you actually give us the name badges back, because that's how we populate the drawing. This is tonight's meeting with Dan. I'm going to let Dan introduce himself. Next month, we'll be meeting here again, and it'll be Woody Zuhl doing mob programming, a whole team approach, which will be quite interesting. And if you haven't experienced that, you will find it intriguing and either really enjoyable or really annoying, depending on your disposition. If you care about getting PMI PDUs for this, come talk to Volker. He doesn't know that he was being volunteered for this, but and I'm pretty sure we forgot to bring the tickets with us. So, but you can let us know and we'll set you up with that. For those of you who don't know, we do have a website, and mostly we work on the Meetup site. We are at the end of our available cash, so we're inviting you to contribute to that, and we will be looking for sponsorship, which is an opportunity if your organization wants to get some publicity and to get mentioned, and also to support the local Agile community. It's an opportune way to do that. Those of you who don't know, this is an all-volunteer organization, and so it only actually, what's happened here is based on what we make happen as a community. So we'll invite you to volunteer for next year. You can join what we call the coordinating committee. At the moment, the most regular participants are the four of us. So neither Michael nor Elena are here. Elena's in Africa. Michael's back east. Volker and I are here. If you have questions or interest in having a conversation about the Bay ALN, please come talk to us after the session. The coordinating committee meeting happens on December 7th. It's a phone conference call, and the meeting information is up on Meetup, and you're welcome to join us if you're curious, and or if you want to contribute because you think what we're doing is cool, which, by the way, it is. So there's a new button on the Meetup site about donating, and if you're finding this useful or valuable, we encourage you to. We're sufficiently out of money that I paid for the pizza tonight. You're welcome. This was, an error on my part, as in I didn't start funding early enough. So the other thing that's happening now, which is new, is that we're Dayspring, which is the nonprofit sponsor of Bay ALN, is starting this new program which provides Agile trainings on a pay-what-you-can basis. So from zero up to whatever you're willing to contribute, and these are the next trainings. These are day-long trainings, and there'll be pointers to Meetup sites and, sorry, not Meetup, Eventbrite sites. So if you have interest, the reason Woody's up here doing the mob programming for us is that he's doing a day-long mob programming pay-what-you-can class. And then we have visual facilitation and the unifying framework for process change. So this is new. We just launched it, and hopefully folks in the Agile community, including yourselves, will find that useful or interesting or valuable. And I'd really also welcome if you decide to participate in one of those, if you'd let us know how it's going, what it's like. Um, this is an opportunity for us to express our gratitude for Rackspace for hosting us. So now would be the time for a round of applause. Another unexpected benefit of being here is that they're also videotaping this um, at no extra cost to us. And this gentleman here, Wes, is doing that and staying late and contributing his skills. So thanks. That said, this matters. So what we want to make sure is there's nobody but us who are doing this. So we really want um, us to leave no trace. So at the end, don't just run out. Let's make sure that we leave things clean and well set up as it is now. I already talked about looking for work. Refreshments were provided by Rackspace and Outformations. And I think, oh yeah, special thanks to the volunteers for helping out. There's another round of applause. And now I think that's it. Yep. Let's swap this out and
Okay, so today we're going to talk about Agile leadership patterns. And actually, what we're going to do is we're going to start with what I call the Agile base patterns. These are patterns that appear in every Agile methodology. And well, I should say in some Agile methodologies, they don't appear. But when they don't appear, you see dysfunctions in those methodologies. So we'll talk a little bit about that. My name is Dan Greening. I have a little independent consulting firm called Cenex Rex. And I am also a certified Scrum coach, which is kind of a rarity. There are more certified Scrum trainers than there are coaches. So there's like 90, I think, in the world. I was the head coach for Skype globally. So I traveled a lot to Europe and the US. And I was also at Citrix Online, which was in India, Europe, and the US. And I've been a startup guy for a while, and I actually have a PhD in computer science. So that is my built-in bullshit detector. When engineers, when engineering, the folks sometimes say, "Oh yeah, we looked into it," but that helps me a little bit when we explore that idea. So here's our agenda for today. First, we're going to talk about why lean and agile methodologies arose. They've been around for about 40, 50 years or more. I mean, in fact, they've been around for millennia because they succeed in certain circumstances where, heavy planning approaches fail. And when we talk about that, we'll talk about why, when we know why they arose, we can start understanding a little bit more about why the patterns in agile methodologies are there. What problems do they actually solve? So then we'll talk a little bit about organizations that fail to sustain agility. That's one of my favorite topics. I have seen, and many of you have also seen, large organizations make a commitment to adopt agile practices. They actually do it, and then they get real successes that are measured and clear, and then they degrade and decline. So a few months ago, we had Yahoo spoke here, and they are one of the examples, unfortunately, where they adopted agile practice. They got regular shipping rates out, and things were going great. And then it declined. They did it again. They did it again, and the most recent one hopefully will take. But those failures are really interesting, right? Like, why would that happen? Like if you were a manager of an organization, it sure seems to me that if you're more rapidly able to adapt to market changes, that would be a benefit that you would want to retain. And yet, time and time again, they are not retained. And so that's really interesting. And then finally, we'll talk about the leadership part of this topic. What do agile managers and leaders do? So, what should we look for when we're hiring a manager to ensure that agility will be retained in the organization? What? Oh, geez. All right. Sorry, man. Okay, so when we go back a little bit in time, not way back to some of the military adopters of Agile, but instead 40 or 50 years ago to when Toyota started doing it. Toyota was a major pioneer. It did something called just in time, JIT, lean manufacturing. And the general idea was this, that someone would order a car and they would not have actually built the car in advance. They would take the order at the front door and they would say, uh-oh, we have to start acting really fast to build all the components for the car. They would start by saying, okay, what are the major components? We need a chassis, a body, a drivetrain, and the wheels. And then they would propagate these Kanban cards through the organization, and the cards would make a request for one of the components. So you started out with the big components, and then it would gradually, you would start talking about the details. So what happened with Toyota was that at some point they said, "Oh gosh, we need tires. We need 4 tires for this car." And then they would say, well, we don't manufacture tires. We have to go to our supplier. So they would go to the supplier. This is not exactly how it happened, but you can think of it this way. We go to our supplier and say, gosh, we need 4 tires and these kinds of tires. And the tire manufacturer would say, well, you should have ordered that 3 months ago because we're currently tooled to build a certain set of tires and they're not those. And then Toyota would say, well, we just got an order. And then the tire manufacturer would say, well, tough rocks, like it's time. Maybe we should figure something out. Toyota's response to that actually was counter to the way normal business was practiced. They said, well, gosh, maybe we should teach you how to respond to requests like this and respond rapidly and serve our needs because that will help you too. The general idea is if you adapt to what the demand is rather and wait for that demand to start really working on it, you don't build up big inventories of cars that might or might not sell. Anyway, so that was their specialty. General Motors was around at the same time, and they did pretty much the converse of that. They would try to forecast what the demand for cars would be, and they would build up an inventory that would satisfy that demand. And so they actually ran like this for many, many decades. Well, not many, many decades, but a few decades, right? Ford pioneered this idea. They said things like, Model T comes in any color you want as long as it's black. And the reason they said that is because they didn't really want variety of cars. They really wanted to sell one type of car because they needed kind of a uniformity and they wanted a uniform product to satisfy a set of demand and they didn't want variable demand. Because when they got variable demand, then they would get excess cars that they would have to get rid of. But the reality of the world changed, right? Like we started being able to put options in our cars and so forth. And so what we saw in the 70s, my dad was a car dealer actually. And so in the 70s and 80s, what we saw was oftentimes the car manufacturers would provide these enormous discounts, thousands of dollars of rebates for particular models of cars. And what was happening there is that they had forecast incorrectly the demand for particular cars, and they were trying to get rid of a bunch of inventory that was just sitting there taking up capital. So Toyota also pioneered this idea of continuous improvement, that everyone in the organization is looking for how can we improve our processes. Unfortunately, General Motors was saddled with contract dictated actions. This was, unions have value, but one of the problems with many unions is that they contractually state what people are doing in a particular job title. So they reduce, if you think about the effect on agility, that would kind of cause a big problem because you can't shift your workforce rapidly from one type of work to another because of those contract dictated actions. And they also had similar types of contracts related to dealers, which my dad was subjected to. But he also had benefits. He had a particular region that he could sell cars in, and no competition could come into that region for the particular makes of cars he had. Toyota also had something called top-down alignment. Um, and this is called Hoshin Conry, and Gail Faria has talked about this here, I think, but also as a specialist in this area. The general idea is that the values of the organization are determined at the top, and then we bubble it down through the organization and ask people in different departments to interpret these goals of the organization relative to their particular activities in the organization. And then there's a feedback loop that allows those people to say, hey, this isn't really going to work for us. And are you aware of this other problem? But it starts from the top and it moves down. General Motors did try to do that, but they also had a lot of plant manager autonomy. And this will factor into a failure of agility that occurred in General Motors that was pretty dramatic. They Toyota had this notion of collective responsibility, that everybody was responsible for producing a high quality car. General Motors had a role-based responsibility idea that whatever your job was, you did it, and whatever your boss told you to do, you did that. And finally, Toyota had this idea called respect for people. And I guess I have to explain what that means. It means that people, well, it's funny because respect for people, you think like you're just nice to people. But that isn't actually, I think, what Toyota was talking about. What they were saying there is that people are smart, they're adaptable, they think, they are really, important brain power in the organization. They don't, they're the thing that they don't have is mechanical repeatable skill sort of thing. We don't actually want people to have to do that stuff. And so what you see in Toyota is they relied much more on robotics and uh, automation earlier than GM did, in part because they were trying to exploit the really important things that people brought, which is the ability to bring smarts to bear. So, so that they call this automation. This idea that we want to automate, but the things that require smarts, we're going to rely on humans to do. And that was pretty cool. So General Motors, on the other hand, had this very hierarchical, militaristic sort of organization. And you can see it if you go to Detroit because the GM headquarters is in this, palace called the Detroit Renaissance Center. And the workers are actually in factories distributed throughout the U.S. So obviously we have some results from that. GM was successful for a long time, and we have to honor them for that. But they went bankrupt in 2008, I think. And Toyota, started out as a dinky little company, and it became the most profitable company, most profitable auto company in the world, even though it didn't produce the most cars. So that's interesting, understanding this contrast. So much later, we had a crisis in software, which seems like it's not really related to manufacturing or automobiles or anything like that. Um, and unfortunately, the resolution of the screen is not very good, but I can just sort of tell you, you can see the magnitude of these numbers. This is like 2.6 billion cost of failure for a software project that the FAA sponsored to automate aircraft, uh, flight control. Yeah. So in each of these areas, the the rough average cost of large projects failing in a particular year that was surveyed by this paper by Charette, Why Software Fails in IEEE Spectrum, was roughly about $500 million to $1 billion a year on average. And so that started getting our attention as software engineers. That was happening back in the 80s and 90s. And we said, what can we do about this? This cost is very high. And in fact, we would see this type of failure over here. So waterfall, which is traditionally how we did software back then, was plan everything up front, line up all your resources, get all the developers doing what you ask them to do, or you start prototyping. Then you get software developers to do what you want them to do. Then you get a bunch of testers involved to test what you did. And then you ship it to customers, and that was an 18-month cycle. And so that seemed to make sense because that what we do today is iteration, right? But that didn't make sense to people back then. And it didn't make sense because if you ship every month, there's a big cost to that. There's a cost in testing, there's a cost in packaging, there's a cost in shipping, particularly back then when software was shipped on CDs at the best, or a handful of diskettes or something like that at the worst. So, so that was the way things were done, perhaps because of the major cost in packaging at the end. But here are the results from waterfall type projects, even as late as 2011. Of course, many projects are done in waterfall still. And most of those projects have a little bit of iteration in them because Agile is so sexy. We try to do that. But in fact, what we see is that the number of clear successes in software projects is 14%. This was a survey by Standish in 2011. It was thousands of projects are surveyed every year by this organization. So 14% of the projects succeeded. 57% were challenged. And what I mean by that is that they're either really over budget or they didn't produce the functionality that was expected. And 29% were abject failures, that the project was funded, it went through to completion, and then the users didn't adopt it or the organization just threw it away. Does that make sense? So that's a pretty high cost. And so when you're looking at costs like that, your failure rates like that, you might be willing to pay a lot to solve that problem. And Agile was a payment towards solving that problem. So Agile, which has this iteration structure now that we actually try to ship every month or less, it turns out that it has a much higher success rate. 42% of Agile projects were considered to have succeeded. There's still a failure rate though, right? Like 9% of projects that are called Agile failed. And then 49% are challenged. So this is about a tripling of the success rate. And that's really good. This little 9% though definitely explains, I think I saw in Slashdot today that there was some posting that said, is Scrum really valuable? Like it's probably, and then a bunch of people said it's crap. But then most people said, when we did Scrum and we did it right, it was very successful for us. And so this is why you get this kind of arguing, because software projects do fail, right? And sometimes people don't necessarily implement things very well. So any questions so far? All right. So let's talk about why my button went crazy. Let's talk about agility. So I was approaching a problem. I'm really interested in the scalability of Agile. And I'm also really interested in enterprise level at agility. And I said, I want to write about the kinds of things that I did with enterprise agility because I think they're really valuable. And many of you know some of these things now, and they're incorporated into most of the scaling practices. But then as I did it, I kept asking, why do we do this? What is the purpose of agility? And I'm like one of the people who's, I think a lot of people who try to sell agile kind of don't tell you there's a cost. Okay, there is a real cost to it, and so I'm going, why are we paying that cost? What's the purpose of that? Well, the purpose of it is, we look at what agile organizations can do. They can sense change in their environment. They can sense that the market is changing, or they can sense that their team composition is changing and therefore they are able to do different things or they're less able to do certain things. They can sense, they can adapt to that, so they can analyze their own situation, what they're seeing in the marketplace or what they're seeing in their team, and then they can create something new that better adapts to what they're experiencing. And they can do that faster than things are changing. So I put this term in here. It's kind of a, a term that I'll start to define, of chaos. It turns out that many economies are have a property that appear to have a property that I'll call chaos. So chaos theorists study that stuff. So if an organization can sense, adapt, and create something new faster than its competitors can in a highly chaotic environment, they're more likely to win than their competitors can. So that's the advantage of agility, and that's worth something to pay for. So, so here's what chaos is. So chaotic systems are mathematical systems in this area of complexity theory and other stuff like that. And I won't spend too much time talking about it for those of you who are not interested in mathematics. But the general idea of chaotic systems is that they are predictable in the short term, and they're less predictable the farther out in time you go. And that lowered predictability, what happens is, if I know exactly where I am, let's say I'm trying to bet on the stock market. If I actually know the theory behind chaos theory is that if I know exactly where everyone is, if I know how much money people have, if I know what they're intending to spend money on and how those intentions will evolve over time, if I know the exact state of that economy and I start simulating that economy, I will be able to predict exactly what the economy will look like 20 years from now. Accept this for me with sort of like a, okay, I suppose in some theoretical world this could be possible. So, so 20 years from now, we'll know exactly what the stock market will do, right? The problem with chaotic systems is if we are off, if our measurements are inaccurate by any amount, that inaccuracy magnifies exponentially over time. And so every chaotic system has a time signature associated with it. Some chaotic systems diverge really fast. Some chaotic systems don't diverge fast at all. So if we're in a mining company and we're just trying to determine where the veins of different products that we're trying to mine out of the ground are, it's probably a very slow moving chaotic system. So we only have to look at the system in the mine maybe every few months, right? But if we're working on a startup company and we have this idea, but we're not really sure it's going to work, and it's in the mobile space, and it's using the cloud, and it's doing something really radically new, then this chaotic time will be much faster. our predictions are likely to be wrong pretty quickly. And so we have to sense, adapt, and create faster to deal with those more chaotic systems. Did I lose everyone? Okay. Okay, good. So this is why startups, it's really important to use agile practices. And what am I talking about when I talk about agile practices? I'm talking about, of course, Scrum, but I'm also talking about Kanban. I'm talking about something called Lean Startup. How many people know what Lean Startup is? All of us. Okay, that's cool. So I think of Scrum as a, a, an agile system that is trying to reduce the cost of producing software. Okay. Now, a lot of people will initially go, well, that's not really true. It's trying to produce more value. But in fact, it's not. I think I'm right. And I'll make this argument right now that I think it's a cost reducing system because all the value is built into one oracle of value called the product owner. So the product owner is the person that ranks the backlog. Scrum doesn't tell us how that backlog is ranked. It just says uh, that teams have to estimate the rough amount of time that it will take to do something. And so what the product owner has to do is the product owner has to figure out how much value that is and compute the ratio of the value of this particular product item or product backlog item against the ratio of value to effort of some other item and put the most profitable item first. That's what we sort of hope they will do. But we don't actually tell the product owner what to do really in Scrum. So that's why I say it's a cost saving system. But I actually think lean startup is the converse of it, right? Like if you study lean startup stuff, they don't talk about effort. They don't talk about estimating effort. They don't talk about really backlogs or anything. They talk about doing market experimentation and different ways to think of market experimentation and different ways of measuring what the market will do with a product like yours. And so those two things work really well together. Most of us have probably seen companies that said, oh, yeah, we were using Scrum and we decided that didn't work. And so we went to lean startup. We decided to adopt a different methodology. Of course, that's kind of crazy, right? Like those two things belong together. So, what did I see today? I saw someone say, we were using Scrum, but we ditched that because it wasn't working. And instead, we adopted acceptance test driven development. I thought, really? That is crazy, right? Like they belong together. All these things can work together. So what I did when I had this conception of chaos, and then I started thinking about this is what agile organizations do, then I said, what properties do all agile methodologies have? And I'll describe it to you. It won't be in this talk, but what I did was I took every single activity from Kanban to Scrum to XP. I even did things like Pomodoro and getting things done, and of course Lean Startup and other stuff. And I basically wrote all of the activities, all of the roles, and all of the artifacts down. And I started trying to visually cluster them for myself. I said, what purpose do these things serve? What activities feel like they belong together, that they serve the same type of purpose? When I did that, it actually it kind of became pretty clear that there were roughly 5 different things that agile practices did. And virtually everything in every one of these practices could be bucketed into one of these patterns. So we'll go through these patterns and we'll see if you think that I'm right or I'm crazy. So, or both. And the other thing you can do when we're going through this, if you're familiar with the Agile Manifesto, which it's called the Agile Manifesto for Software Development. One of the issues that I had with the Agile Manifesto is I would try to bring this to CEOs and I would say, you should run an Agile organization. You don't have to apply it to software. And then they would say, well, how do I know whether my organization is Agile or not? And then I would have to pull out the definition that we had for agility, which is the Agile Manifesto for Software Development, right? And then they would go, well, what does this mean, contract negotiation? And what does it mean that you have working software? We're not even doing software, we're doing marketing, right? And so I would have to interpret it for them. So this will also address that problem for me, that I wanted something that I could go to an executive and I could say, here's how you are agile. So let's look at this pattern. So fixed budget creativity often fails. So what is a pattern? A pattern is a problem. It states a problem in a context. It is a format, actually, that was developed by an architect named Christopher Alexander in the 70s to describe urban planning systems that worked. And he has like 250 patterns in architecture and urban planning. And they all have this format. The general format is this: they describe the problem, and then they describe the forces that would constrain a solution to that problem. And then they describe the solution. So if you look at a well-written pattern, you'll see this long discussion of all the forces that constrain a solution before you even see the solution. And that's very helpful because what it does is it helps us, reinforces in our brains, oh yeah, this is the obvious solution to this particular problem. So unfortunately, a lot of people who write patterns skip that step where they talk about the forces that constrain a solution. But I tend not to, and it costs me a little bit because there's probably a lot of words that go into describing the forces. And yet, that is helping you in the future, always knowing sort of what the forces are. Why am I doing this? And what do I want to avoid? How can I avoid problems? So, anyway, here's this one. Fixed budget creativity often fails. So, if we plan way up front, we have a bunch of creative stuff going on. Uh, we find that those plans are often dashed by the time the 18 months is up. So the first property I wanted to mention is economics drives virtually everything we do. So the definition of economics is trying to create something using a limited set of resources. So when I say that, you notice I didn't say dollars in that statement. It's not necessarily dollars. It's maybe people on your team. It's maybe time. There's many things that can be limited when you're dealing with an economic system. And so Scrum is kind of an economic system, but it's based on good utilization of a few people in your team. So economies produce value with limited resources. So that's interesting. And then forces. What are the forces? Well, success metrics lag the work. So that's a pretty important thing. The stock price for our company is going to rise 2 years or 3 years after we finally produce a product that's successful in the market. So we can't really adapt using that type of metric. We can't use a normal success metric. The other force that we notice is that people don't really want to think about risk. They rarely measure risk in system, and because it's kind of scary, risk involves failure, and that's kind of weird. And then another force that's is that creativity generates variation. By its nature, when we create something, we don't know, we've never seen anything like it before. And software is highly creative, right? Like if we're going to build another accounting system, why don't we just buy it and copy the software and install it in our company, right? Instead, what we see is, well, maybe we write an accounting system, but it's usually for something really exotically new. And so that creativity means also we don't know if it's going to work. We don't have any examples of that today. So, given those forces And given that particular problem, that creativity is really not very good with fixed budgeting, why don't we instead measure our economic progress with leading indicators? Why don't we figure out some top level goals and then have everyone that's working on that particular activity align their mission with the overall goals of whatever organization we have, whether it's the big company or even if it's the little team. And then let's find leading metrics for all of our goals. So we can do it for sure for companies, and we always do it for teams. So it's easy to think about a team. What is a metric, a leading indicator that a team often measures? Velocity, yes. So that is a very common leading indicator. It's not a very accurate. It's not very accurate, but it's accurate enough. It tells us roughly how much software was built, how much effort was exerted. And if you use reference stories in particular, you can tell whether you are accelerating or not, which is a nice property of that type of metric. So leading indicators, this is typical leading indicator thing. Leading indicators are here, and you can see this leading indicator doesn't necessarily predict what's going to happen with the lagging indicator, which is the variable of interest. But it's close, right? It's close enough to help us help guide our progress. And that's what agile organizations operating in a chaotic economy need. They need a guide for whether they're doing the right thing or maybe the wrong thing. And they need to use some smarts to decide which one of those it is. So there's other funny properties of metrics, and that is leading indicators on their own tend to be perverse. So that is actually a term of art, a perverse metric. A perverse metric is it tells you how much porn there is over there in the net team. So higher velocity is associated with more porn. So no, actually, perversity means that the metric is really not structured to lead to it. It appears to be structured to lead to a good outcome, but it will actually lead the organization to be dysfunctional if that's the metric you're using. And so velocity is virtually any single metric, any single leading metric is perverse. So let's use velocity as an example. Why is velocity a perverse metric? Say again? Localized. Okay, it's localized. But what bad outcome could come from us only measuring velocity? If we were trying to improve our velocity and that was our primary goal, what would suffer? Quality. Someone said quality. Estimating. What does that mean? They're lying. Right. Right. That is true. That is a perverse outcome of velocity driving everything. And I've seen that in companies where estimation is the way we estimate is affected by if someone says we need to double our velocity, all you have to do in a scrum team is just change what your definition of a story point so that it's smaller than you thought. So in any event, uh, that is a perverse thing. Lying is one of the dangerous outcomes of most metrics in organizations, and we have to be very cautious of that culturally. If metrics are really good, I'm a metrics guy, but one thing that is obvious is that when people derive promotions and they derive career paths and other stuff like that from metrics, that will lead to lying and dissembling throughout the organization, and it will destroy your culture. So what you want those metrics to do is basically guide you, but not necessarily to determine your success. So, so what is another perversity with velocity? Anybody have any other ideas? Yes. Well, what would be the what's the downside of that? Okay, that's fair, but there that still isn't necessarily bad. What could happen? So now you've got one team, it's twice as fast according to story points than the other team. They have the same number of people. So what? What's the perverse part? Yeah, what if the higher team actually sucks? You know? Right? It generates this, and it also generates competition, which can degrade problems, and it can degrade communication in the organization. There's a lot of things. So what generally people who are metric freaks like me uh, look at metrics and they say, well, we kind of need about three different metrics in any situation to really balance each other out. And so I'll tell you what I like to do in Scrum. I like three metrics to be used. I like a velocity metric to be used, but I also like a quality metric. So one form of a quality metric is how many bugs escaped the team and went into the wild, into you know, got released. So, so I want to know the number of escaped bugs. So that's called the escape bug count. Another metric that Jeff Sutherland really likes is something called bug fix time. So every time an outside person reports a bug, how long did it take the team to fix the bug and put a fix into the wild? There's a third metric that I really like, and that is happiness. How many people measure happiness in their team? Does anyone do that? You. Okay. So this is the happiness metric, and we'll even measure your happiness so far. So how many people are I want you to think about it before you raise your hand because I don't want any anchoring in this group. So, how many people are unhappy with this talk so far? How many people are happy with this talk so far? Are happy with this talk so far? And how many people are kind of neutral about it? So, thinking about where you would put your thumb and decide where that would be, not as good as you wished it were, think it's really good, think it's neutral. Now I want you to raise your hand and not change your mind as soon as you raise your hand. So neutral, up. It's a lot of neutrals, a few ups, couple no downs yet. One down. All right. So that metric helps us understand how well we're satisfying each other in the team. And so what can happen is if you have a high velocity and if you have a really good quality, you could be driving the team too hard and they could actually maybe not be communicating very well or they could have other dysfunctions and the happiness metric will reveal that. So maybe I should just go a little faster. So the result of this, if you actually apply this pattern where you're measuring leading indicators and is that you gain coherency in the organization. So you'll have mission and vision goals that align very well. Employee and team behavior will be well aligned. And uh, if the economy isn't changing much, we can react, learn, and forecast from what we see. So if it's not changing very much, the variation in the economy that's happening is giving us information. We don't have to do anything actively to kind of adapt to what's happening in the marketplace. Okay? So if all we do is measure, that's really great. What I discover when I talk to teams, when I talk to organizations about agility, is about half or more of those organizations and teams do not even apply this pattern. So this is the very first pattern, I think, of an organization that is agile. You have to measure whether you're succeeding or not using some kind of leading indicator. If you're not doing it, you probably can't be agile. So let's talk about these patterns. There's 5 of them. We talked about the first one, and I'm going to ask, are we agile? Why might we not be able to adapt, sense, and create fast enough to match our economy if all we do is measure? Why couldn't we? Why might we not adapt? What? There could be a lag. Yes, that's true. The metrics might not be quite right. What else? Why could a competitor come and trounce us if we're just measuring our economy and sort of they could actually, right? They could find some way to innovate, and then that innovation could lead them to find a faster way to reach success and beat the crap out of us. But that's because we're sitting there passively. So reacting is not enough. If all we do is measure our stuff, we can just sit here and we go, well, there hasn't been a train here in a few days, and I think I'll just read the paper. So, um, so in order to avoid that problem, we need to proactively experiment. So this is the type of experimentation where you're actually hypothesizing something that you wouldn't be able to detect normally in your operation, where you actually have to make some changes to actually do those tests. So this happens in Scrum retrospection. If you're doing a really good retrospective, what you do is you measure, you say, okay, our last sprint, we thought we would have a velocity of 30, and we actually got a velocity of 10. Has anybody had that kind of thing happen? I have. I've seen it in a million teams. So they put 30 points worth of stuff in their sprint backlog, and then they got 10 done. So that happens all the time. And so, but what doesn't happen all the time is in the retrospection, they never say, oh, our hypothesis was 30 and we got 10. That doesn't happen very often. When it does happen, people say, well, maybe we ought to be better at hypothesizing what we're going to do. And furthermore, why did we get 10? That was a failure. Our experiment failed to validate its hypothesis. And so you brainstorm about what has the past data told you. And then you construct a hypothesis and test it, but you also have to control the experiment. So in other words, if you decide in your retrospection that we're going to use a new type of, if we're going to use we're going to test something like we're going to have a stronger done criteria where we are going to say we are not going to accept backlog items that depend on another team. We're not going to accept that into our sprint backlog. We'll just push that away. So what do you think will happen if we only work on product backlog items that have few dependencies, no dependencies from other teams? What will happen? You're going to help me. What? So, okay. What will happen? What will happen with our velocity? If we make a rule that says we're not going to take backlog items into our sprint that are not ready, meaning that let's say that we have everything we need from all our teams, those only things we'll accept into our sprint. What will happen? It'll go up. Our velocity will definitely go up, right? So that would be an experiment you could test. But the problem is that you would have to control the experiment. Someone would have to ensure that you really didn't take anything in that depended on other stuff. And that person turns out to be the Scrum Master. That's one of their roles. They control the experiment once the experiment is decided. So this retrospection is really great because you're constructing an experiment. And then once the experiment is decided, the Scrum Master's role is to protect that experiment. We call it protecting the team, but in fact, they do more than that. So we test different theories, and we have to be careful about variability because creativity is variable. So the problem that we've seen in organizations where variability is measured and controlled would be like 3M. So 3M was a highly creative organization, and it became it became a much less creative organization about 10 years ago when they adopted Six Sigma for virtually everything in the organization. And that's partly because Six Sigma demands variability control. So this is sort of a diagram of what Scrum retrospectives look like from my perspective. They're the very first meeting in a sprint. That sounds kind of weird, right? So what they do is they look at what we know from the past about software development, and then they say, okay, what experiment are we going to try? So they write down what are the rules of the game for the coming sprint. And so the rules changes can be all sorts of stuff. It could be how long our sprint will be. It can be how whether we use TDD. It can be pairing. It can be a million things. But whatever those rules are, someone's got to enforce them in order to get a controlled experiment that tells us something. And that person is the Scrum Master. So then the sprint cycle, all this stuff in here is part of the experiment. And so could you run Kanban in there instead? Sure, right? And the cool thing about running Kanban in this structure is that you can compare whether Kanban or Scrum works better. Because if you're measuring velocity in the same way, if you're measuring quality in the same way, you can run these retrospectives with multiple teams and you can make some conclusions about one of them working better than the other. I don't know what the answer will be for your organization, but if you're not doing retrospectives, you don't know. So I think a lot of people don't run experiments. They just say, hey, Scrum didn't work for us, so let's go use Kanban. And they don't know why. So I can talk a little bit about this. Generally speaking, if you're not getting anything, if all of your experiments are successful, you don't learn anything. So if you're over here, everything's successful. We think we're going to get. Our hypothesis is our velocity will be 10, and it's 30 one week, and it's 50 the other week. That's always successful. That's really great, but we aren't learning anything. What we really want to do is we want to push our hypothesis towards the actual results we really expect. And then we want to look for weird things that happen, like we thought it would be this, but it failed. And then we dig deeper and we discover more that way. This is how real scientists work. They're looking for an invalidation rate of about 50% that helps them learn more. And it will help you learn more. And the problem is, here are two different situations that happen in teams and organizations that create dysfunction. A manager can say, hey, you guys, I want you to have a stretch goal. I want you to get a velocity of 50, or I want you to be able to deliver this software in 6 months, even though you said it would take 9. And so that's a stretch goal, and that fails, right? And it fails every single quarter because, and then what happens is it creates sloth and I don't care anymore. You guys are setting these goals that we can never achieve. And then we don't even know whether we could achieve any of these because we just gave up trying. So that's this world. So the other world is what teams do when teams take when teams start having a really strong sense of self-organization but don't really care about the customer anymore, that's this team, right? Like, oh, we're happy, we're always producing, we don't have to estimate anymore, and that's just wastes a lot of time anyway. And we're just producing software and we just care what the product owner wants, right? So they are operating here where they're succeeding all the time and it's a happy world, but they're really not necessarily serving the customer better. And so there's some happy middle where we're doing both. So proactive experimentation is pretty clearly associated with hyperproductivity. So Jake Jacobson and Sutherland studied this in an organization in the Netherlands called Systematic Corporation, and they got 100% faster production with 40% higher quality when they applied retrospection in a better way. This is a great paper, by the way. And so this proactive experimentation is organizations disrupting themselves. So, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll actually give, if you give me a card or an email, I will send you a paper that's coming out in January on this topic too. So, so that's the second one. How many people think that their teams are running good retrospectives in this way? They're running experimentation and they're doing stuff. Okay, 5. So suddenly we've left the world of reality. And when people are saying that we do agile, we're not actually measuring stuff and running experiments, right? So the unfortunate thing about this is it's creating this challenge to us. And it's not a very difficult challenge to meet, actually. If we are measuring stuff, it's really easy to measure stuff, and it's really easy to run experiments, but we don't do them. We usually phone in our retrospection. So the last pattern, and this third pattern is the 3 patterns are all you need, I assert, for agility. Last pattern is that utilization creates delay. So you're probably familiar with the project manager or the boss who goes and looks at the team, and some people are reading, and some people are playing foosball, and then but they're really smart. And then the manager says, "Why aren't you working?" Right? So we feel better if everybody is busy, and then but then we say, "Why can't they get their stuff done on time?" And then lastly, we give them more, and they get less done. So this is a phenomenon that is repeated over and over in organizations. What is going on here? So this is what's going on here. So here is a freeway in, I think, Bangkok, and it looks pretty congested, right? Pretty heavy utilization. Which side of this freeway is going faster? Like, it's totally screwed, right? But one of them, I bet, is going faster. Which side? Left side is going faster. Why is that? More gaps, right? And it's less utilized, right? So this is the way this curve works. This is so if you have a system that responds in a time unit of 1, and it has like a queue in front of it. Let's say it's 50% utilized. It looks like it's going to have an extra. It's going to take twice as much time to get through the system if it's utilized 50% of the time. That's a pretty low number, right? Like, so in other words, this kind of explains our world, right? Our creative work world. We probably aren't working more than about 50% of the time when we're at work in actuality. But here's what happens when the boss starts yelling at you and says you've got to be working all the time. What happens is all of your team members are going to be working 100% of the time, and well, probably 90% of the time, and it's going to take forever to get something out. So this is just the mechanics of utilization. When people are saying you're so lazy, no one's really busy, you guys really need more work to do, the danger is that you're pushing the delay up, and that could be okay if you don't have a chaotic economy. So if you don't have to adapt really fast, it could be fine if you have these huge delays. But in fact, most of us working in this space do have chaotic economies. There's a cognitive utilization problem too, that our brains are limited in our ability to think about stuff. So we can think about roughly 7 plus or minus 2 concepts at a time. This was work done by George Miller back in the 50s. And the problem is, if we are thinking about more concepts than this, it degrades our ability to make good decisions. And so we see situations like this, where you have, I'll assert, more than 7 things in your backlog. Your product owner isn't making good decisions about the ordering of the things in the backlog because it's too hard to think about all those concepts. And so if you have giant backlogs with hundreds of things in them, here is an assertion I'll make that someone has made an architectural decision and it is frozen in time. So someone has decomposed your architecture so finely with all these hundreds of things in your backlog that you have no choice but to do a particular architecture, even if you discover there's something wrong with that architecture. You might have to blow up a whole, if you really were responsible, you would just throw away a bunch of backlog items and replace them with revised backlog items that adapted to this new reality. But in fact, that doesn't happen in most organizations. I saw this in Skype all the time that, aggressive product owners would, put 200 items in a backlog, and then it was just awful, right? Like no one could make any changes at all, and they produced work that was really bad. So, so geometric backlogs help make trade-offs. And what I mean by a geometric backlog is where the first things in the backlog are small. Let's say the first 7 to 14 items are things that could fit in a sprint. And then the next 7 to 14 items are about 10 times as big, which sounds kind of ridiculous to some people when they first hear it. But you can actually write user stories that are very big. You can say, our system will accommodate 100,000 people visiting in every 60 seconds. And so that is a pretty big thing. Underneath that, there's some architectural decisions that have to be made. So geometric backlogs just get bigger and bigger as you go down. They get exponentially bigger as you go down. So you could have a backlog that only had 40 items in it. And with that 40 items, you would define a year or two's worth of work. And it's actually really helpful for teams because you're communicating what the goals of this product are over a long period of time. And they start making decisions that are better architecturally. Yes. Okay. I wish I could say that I have found something super successful, but if they're mathematically inclined, I can describe this and they totally get it. And then there's other situations where, you know, people who aren't mathematically inclined off, or, just are not really interested in this, and they don't do anything, like they don't. It's so frustrating, right? Like you and I are, and all of us in here who are agile coaches are often frustrated with people who have been brought up a particular way, and then you bring evidence and all sorts of stuff to bear and they just will not understand it. And this is an interesting challenge. Lisa Adkins is kind of my dual in the world. She is a holistic person who's got a what we call an I-we perspective, and I'm like this very analytical, nerdy guy that has an its perspective, and we have conversations every month about that. And we both share this problem. What do we do with these people who will not change? So okay, so there you go. Limiting work and process um, is it says shorten your backlog. It says ship every sprint, because if you don't ship every sprint, what's happening is you have work in process. It's never been released to a team, or I mean, it's never been released to the world. So you're not able to test it. So that continues to be dragging on forever. Okay. I shouldn't say. So what I should say is, sure. So a team should release its sprint product, its sprint increment, to a consumer that will actually use it. So whether that consumer is an outside user or whether it's just another team, the important thing is someone should use it and should be using the features you've developed and provide feedback to you. So that's what I mean by that. So there's many teams that I've encountered that say they have a 2-week sprint. And in fact, an early version of Safe had this structure too, which was probably embarrassing to Dean Leffingwell when he realized the impact. But they have sprint, 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 release, sprint, 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 release, and they would have 2-week sprints. And so when I went to, I was doing some modeling for the company, and I went to different teams, and I would encounter these teams, and and when I first encountered that, I said, well, that's a problem because you really have an 8-week sprint, right? Because you're not really able to test whether the stuff will work in the field, whether users like it or not, until 8 weeks are done. And it also affects the velocity of the whole organization, because if you have a whole bunch of teams in succession that have to produce something and they take 8 weeks to actually deliver something, you start adding up those weeks pretty fast, and you've got virtually um, waterfall, even though supposedly you're running agile. So limiting work in process says that what I started advising those teams to do is to tell the truth about their sprint length and say, we have an 8-week sprint. And then they would sort of say, but everyone will tell us that we're wrong. And it turns out the management were really supportive of people telling the truth. And so I said, no, this is not going to be a problem. Will respect you for saying it. And they actually did. And then that particular team that did that actually became one of the best performing teams in the company. Not surprisingly, right? Like its metrics were actually reflecting the truth of what the team was doing. So anyway, that's the third pattern. So these three, so you've seen this sort of structure where if we do this actually, there's still work in process really until here, until you produce the whole car. You can't really drive it until you're here. No steering wheel, right? So this is not limiting work in process. This is, right? Like we do a little prototype of something that could roll down the street, and then we add a handle to it, and now it turns into a bicycle. We go faster, now it's a motorcycle. So that's why we have this general idea that a user should be able to use what you're doing, and you can actually test all of these things. So we rapidly deliver small increments of value. There's rapid feedback. The work is cancelable. If we decide it's a dumb product after all, we can take those workers and we can apply them to more fruitful work. And we learn much faster. So, but there's one thing that I think we rarely talk about in Agile is that we really want to manage the number of options to match our cognitive limits. We usually have too many choices. So these three patterns are enough to generate agility, I assert. If you have a methodology, if you have a team, you're measuring economic progress, you're proactively experimenting to improve, and you're limiting work in process so it matches the chaotic rate of your economy, you are going to be agile. And I think it's really hard to do this. So I think it's really hard to do these three things, especially in larger organizations. And so some other patterns that seem to have emerged in virtually all of these methodologies. And this one is in particular, no problems get solved until someone takes responsibility. So if we have a problem and no one says, I'll take care of that, I'll fix that problem, it won't get fixed. And we actually have some behavioral problems in terms of accepting responsibility. There's this guy named Christopher Avery who developed this idea that when there is a problem, like the system crashed at noon the other day, that we follow a process personally when we interpret that problem. We first deny that there's a problem, then we blame someone else, you know, even if we wrote the code that caused the crash, we'll blame the fact that, the automated testing system didn't catch it, or we didn't have any testers that were really doing their job, or, whatever it is. And then someone calls us on it, and then we eventually get to a higher level, supposedly, which is we justify it by saying the system prevented me from doing the right thing. So we stop blaming a person, we start blaming the system, and then we start feeling guilty. And through this whole process, we have done nothing to fix a problem. Nothing happens. We feel obliged to go to work, and we still are doing nothing until we finally say, yes, there was a problem. I will take responsibility for fixing that problem. And so this is related to agility, this process. If we operate through this process slowly, then we are less agile. So the most agile organizations develop this sense of collective responsibility within the team and then within the organization. So we see this in Toyota with this whole idea of they have collective responsibility throughout the organization, and that culture is really important. It creates this agility for them. So embrace. So then, what agile methodologies seem to do is they embrace collective responsibility. So there's a bunch of patterns like this. One of them is in a Scrum team, we don't have developers and testers. And we'd say that, right? Because if we have people that are designated as testers and we have other people that are designated as developers, the workload for testers will shift over time with the maturity of the product. As the product becomes more and more mature, if we aren't paying attention, more and more testing will be required to buy that product towards the end of its life, towards the end of its period versus the beginning. And the problem is if we have names for people and they're only allowed to work on development, not on testing, they won't shift their workload over to help with the testing. So that's one of the reasons why we get rid of that notion. The other thing we see is collective code ownership, which is a principle of XP. It has the same idea that we are individually responsible for the collective output of the team. That's what I mean by collective responsibility. I sign a contract when I join a team. I'm going to be personally responsible for the collective output of this team. So the way we need to do that is we need to teach it. So we actually, this is part of the role of a Scrum Master, is to help the team achieve this sense of collective responsibility. And that's what happens if you have it is you get greater elasticity, and within the team you get collaborative problem solving and increased teaching and learning. So you get, if you only have one database person, it's hard to take collective responsibility for the success of the team because the database person could be out on vacation and then you're screwed, right? So what happens is if you really embrace this notion, people are going to start teaching database principles to other people in the team so that they can adapt to them. So this gives us something to help us with the other three. It gives us a resiliency in agility that we didn't have before. So that's pretty cool, but we still have one big problem with agility, and that is the external factors limit us. So the tire manufacturer who ships something every 90 days, we are dependent on them to produce the car. So these dependencies make us wait. Okay, if they do a perfect job and they give us a great tire, we still have to wait. But what's worse is they make us test more. If the quality they produce is crap, then it incurs a new cycle in our agile world where it causes delay for us. It's not just frustrating, it slows us down. And I saw that in Skype too, where a low level team in the organization, a really deep infrastructure team, they claimed that they were the most agile team in the company because they would, quote, ship every 30 days, unquote. And when they shipped every 30 days, though, they said they shipped it to their beta customers. Well, their beta customers were about 20 other teams in the company. And those 20 other teams growingly got frustrated with the crap that they were producing because they didn't have any automated tests at all. They didn't even have any testers. They relied on the rest of the organization to test. And so what you can imagine what happened. Like people were so frustrated, and then they wouldn't accept the output of this team until after it had been sitting on the shelf for 4 or 5 months, right? Well, guess what? That's a delay. That's really the effect of that. So all of this creates handoff interference, and there's handoff interference between teams, and it causes even more delays. So these are forces for us. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. Sure. Sure. I mean, well, I mean, the first thing that at a minimum, the first thing that you can do is just factor that in and say we are much slower than we think. The other thing that you can do is you can do workarounds. This is what we all do, right? Like we depend on something, and these people are not responding very fast. We can find a second supplier. We can find alternative ways of building something. We can build it ourselves. That's what a lot of people do. Those are very hard problems. The other thing you can do, though, is you can educate them. And the third thing that you can do is you can bring them into a big tent and you can start talking about this, how we are all working together in this big system, right? It turns out that I think one of the best ways to solve this problem is to get your leaders to think about their organizations as agile organizations. So when you're way up at the top, you can apply those principles. You can say, are we making progress? Are we experimenting? Are we limiting work in process? If you're doing that, you can't have that dependency, right? That dependency is, and if especially if that's an internal or team that's causing all the problems, the leader will then see this is screwed up because it's messing up my agility. I have to fix that, and they will actually take action. So I think that's the most effective way if you can get that. Um, so we solve systemic problems. So convert bosses to be agile. That was the solution, right? The other thing you can do is you can build collaborative teams of peer managers, right? So most of us in agile coaching try to apply agile principles to management meetings. We often have strategic goals for managers, and they may be things like recruiting and other stuff like that. All of that stuff is completely doable with agile methods, especially with Kanban or Scrum. And so, so we can start doing all that with agile methods. And then we can ritualize and celebrate problem solving. So, one of the issues here is when I say solve systemic problems, let's just think about what that means. That means we, as a little cog in a giant machine, are starting to say, let's try to understand the machine, right? Someone told us we had to do X, we had to do Y, and we depend on these other people. Let's take a step back and start looking at ourselves within the organization. This is not often done. I mean, this is a pretty advanced tool, I think. Uh, and in fact, a lot of Scrum trainers will actually teach some of these skills, but it's not in the normal Scrum, you know, canon, I guess. Um, and I'll give you an example. At another company, a huge company, 200 teams, I was there for a while and I was dealing with organizational agility issues. And I said, you know what? Actually, I'll show you an example of this. I need to figure out who depends on which team. And I built a map. And then I started shopping it around to managers, like 200 managers, right? And they're going like, where'd you get that map? I said, well, I had to do it myself because you don't have one. And they're going, wow, that's awesome. Can I have a copy? And I'm going like, and then you're sort of going like, well, I guess nobody is watching the store, right? So anyway, these types of things, analyze and change structural systems. So we have lots of tools for this. Lean Kanban is one. Theory of constraints is a big one. I think dependency mapping is a big one. A3, problem solving, and I won't go into the details of those, but there's a lot of tools here. So I will show you this example. This is a couple hundred teams. Well, maybe it's 150 teams. But you see, these are infrastructure teams here. They don't have to have labels. You can just figure out what's going on. Super infrastructure team, like a library team. Then a couple. I think this is a video compression group. So the first data management, and then some audio, video, and something or other transport or something. That's all combined together. Then you can see how that all flows up. If we make a change here, it's going to take a while to get out, right? If we're using Scrum. So one sprint, another sprint, another sprint, another sprint, another sprint, another sprint, 9 sprints. Assuming that we had, let's say they were all synchronized, all these teams could get this little change out in 18, let's say it was 2-week sprints, 18 weeks. So this assumes that everybody's perfect, no bugs, consumed by the other one. Immediately after they finish, they ship. So they're all synchronized so they can just adopt each other's thing. How many people are in companies where the sprints are really synchronized for lots of teams? 3. Right. So the big problem, one big problem is meeting rooms. Like, how do you get meeting rooms together to have synchronized sprints? Very hard to do. Are you guys using SAFe, the ones who raised your hand? Okay, who else? So generally what you have to do is you have to multiply this time by 1.5, because you're gonna probably on average hit somewhere in the middle of the next sprint's cycle time, so they can't really adopt your change until the beginning of the next sprint. So you just multiply by 1.5, so instead of 18, now it's 27 weeks to get out if your sprints are not synchronized. So the other thing to look at with this, which is kind of cool, when we're looking at the system, right? Like we're a little cog in here, but we're looking at the system. Here's what we can do. We can say, hey, could we shrink the height of this tree? That would be a real big benefit. So here are some candidates that we might be able to squish. And I think I talked to all 3 of these groups, and I said, hey, could you squish these 5 teams into maybe 4 teams or maybe 5 teams, but just not have this extra handoff? Could you put something up here, or could you change something? And they said, no, we're working perfectly, blah, blah. And then, and then I said, hey, could you guys over here, there's like 4 of you using this guy, could you guys run in something called a feature team mode, where you actually turn into 4 teams that you're all simultaneously affecting this one library? Nah, that would be too complicated, etc. But what actually we found was we found those guys. And that was a pretty cool discovery. Look at this team. There's only one handoff here. And we looked at that and we said, hey, I actually looked at the diagram. I didn't talk to the teams. I looked at the diagram and said, this is pretty interesting. Like, maybe we should talk to these teams. And I went to talk to them, and it turned out that these 2 teams had been a single team. And they decided that they were getting too big, so they would split up. And then they would create an infrastructure team and a quasi front end team. And I'm going like, okay, and guess what? You just added 3 weeks to the cost, to the delivery time. And they said, oh, we didn't think about that. So anyway, they refactored their thing into 2 feature teams, and they just trimmed 3 weeks off of the cycle time for the company. So this is what can happen when you're thinking about the system. So culture of problem solving occurs when you start thinking systemically, you start getting cross-departmental collaboration, you get faster organizations as a whole. So I think these 3 are a pretty good start for Are We Agile? So these 3 things, we are Agile for sure, but I think it's really easy to lose it. And then when you embrace collective responsibility, it creates this sort of sustainability in the organization. And I will say that all of the practices that I looked at had these 4 in them. What they didn't have often was this, and yet the kind of traditions within teaching in these groups, like Scrum. If you go to a Scrum training, they will teach you often theory of constraints. That is just a thing that we often teach. We teach value stream mapping and a bunch of other stuff. And those things are not that useful for an individual team. They're really useful when you're starting to talk to people outside your team to be able to influence the agility of the organization as a whole. So uh, I asked this question: why do organizations lose agility? And I think what happens is they lose one of these patterns. Oftentimes, the worst one is this one. They stopped measuring, right? So they have these stretch goals that create misery among teams because they're constantly failing to manage those goals. Or they think Agile is just for us as a team to make us feel better and have a more fulfilled life at work. And what happens is they're actually stopping the measurement of the actual goal for the team, which is to make customers happy. So they don't experiment. And that's oftentimes because organizations have risk aversion, and it's often related to career progression, other things like that. Limiting work in process. By far, one of the biggest issues is no automation or little emphasis on automation. You start a project that's agile. If you don't seriously tackle automation up front, you suddenly discover that you're screwed, right? But it takes a few sprints to get there. And then you realize that you're doing regression tests over and over again. And since no one automated it, you have to start hiring more and more testers. That is just the worst, right? So, yeah, no. Well, they are in a sense. So they're a little in process because they help architect the system. So if you have too many things in process, too many cognitive issues in the backlog, it will degrade your architecture. But it's not what work in process. There is a backlog that has work in process in it, and that's the sprint backlog. So the product backlog, I do still recommend limiting work in process in the product backlog by using these geometric style backlogs. But the sprint backlog itself, I actually think that a sprint backlog shouldn't be more than about 7 items, because if you get too many, then you lose this. You lose two things. One is you lose the ability to understand what's in your sprint backlog. And the second thing you lose is you lose collective responsibility. So if you have too many things in your backlog, then it's very tempting to have one person work on one backlog item and another person work on the other one. And pretty soon you're you're potentially going to fail. Right? Does that make sense? Sort of. And then, so the thing that inhibits collective responsibility is assigned responsibility. So managers love this idea of whose neck could I strangle if it doesn't get out, right? Who's accountable for the system? And when they refer to accountability, it's not the way I wish that they would think of accountability, and I would be totally compatible with. Who is the person they can go to find the status of the system? That I would like. I think it's really important for executives to have that type of accountability. But when accountability refers to responsibility, like who is the person that I should wring their neck if the system doesn't go out, or who should have fixed it if the system was broken, that's when you have a problem. And that's what I call assigned responsibility. So the last thing is systemic problems. With these big organizations, this is where a lot of people break their teeth. I think a lot of coaches actually break their teeth here too. That this territoriality issue can really make it impossible for a whole organization to become agile. And so I've actually seen that situation where organizations were restructured into silos, and those silos, someone mentioned silos before, and those are really problematic. And budgeting, developers were assigned to particular projects and stuff like that. And suddenly the whole organization lost a fluidity that it had before. And so it became not agile, and that was a territorial issue. So we can also look at agile managers. We can say, is a manager agile? I like this idea of talking to a potential manager candidate, and how would you interview them? So I've met a zillion managers who claimed that they were, they knew Scrum and they were big advocates of Scrum, or they were agile, or whatever they said. And actually they were the furthest thing from it, right? They had maybe taken the CSM course and they understood the words, but I would ask them these questions. I would say, tell me a little bit about your previous work and how you measured your department's service to the customer. And then if they don't have a good answer, well, they could have, we didn't measure service to the customer, but this is how we would do it. Then I would go, okay, that makes sense. That's good. So have you ever run an experiment? No. I think a lot of managers don't even realize that they could. How did you limit the work in process? How did you keep your people from being overutilized? And then, did you embrace organizational responsibility? There you were in the finance department. There were problems in a certain area. Did you help? Did you help come to the rescue for a different department? And then finally, do you teach, mentor, and coach your skills to others, or do you protect your particular career by keeping all of your knowledge to yourself? So so anyway, I have argued that top-down agile beats bottom-up. By that I mean that if you have agile leaders who are really running their organizations in an agile way, there's no choice for teams, there's no choice for employees. They have to be agile themselves, because they won't be able to satisfy the agile leaders' demands on their whole organization without agility at the lower levels. So I'm not going to go through this slide, but I will tell you that Gallup has a famous, they run this system where they measure the talent of managers, and they have some characteristics of managers that they look for. So these are high talent managers, and about 15% of actual managers fall into this category. And another 10% fall into kind of an intermediate category where they can be trained to be high talent managers. So that gives us about 25% of the actual managers could be high talent managers, and then the rest are terrible, right? It's sad, but I mean that makes sense, right? Like, we work our way up in an organization. A lot of us shouldn't be managers. We're very good individual contributors, and then we get promoted into a management role, and then we can't actually use our talents that we have inherently, but instead we have to learn some totally new talents, like how to facilitate and how to get people working together, and we have to teach and all this other stuff. A lot of people can't make that jump, so it's not surprising, these results, to me, but they all sort of line up with this idea. You can use these base patterns, and you can think about what the effect would be for different managers. And I actually think that agile managers have more talent than a high talent manager. Um, there's a bunch of papers on this stuff and blog posts on this stuff. This is a paper that's going to appear in the Hawaii International Conference on System Science in January, and you can either send me an email or give me a business card, and I'll send you a copy of it before it's printed, like within the next week. This has a lot of detail on these different patterns. Each of these patterns has a big, 3,000 word blog post. And then I have an experiment driven Scrum checklist thing, and I don't know what I did with it, but it's a poster basically, and it's the post. Yeah. Oh, there you go. It's hiding under the computer. So I'll show you what I have here. If you would like one, I have like 30, I think. Oh, I could give away two for your raffle. So this is, you can see it has this retrospective driven sprint. And then it also has a checklist of all the things that people should do in those meetings. So in a retrospective meeting, are you looking at past metrics? Did someone assemble the past metrics? Are you constructing a hypothesis? Are you validating the previous hypothesis and stuff like that? So if you're interested, please pick one up. Yes, I do. And you can email me here to get that as well. All right, let's see. Maybe I'm done. Let's see. Yes, I think I'm done. So this is me. I'm actually seeking assignments right now. I was thinking about moving to Southeast Asia, but then decided that was a dumb idea. So the last year has been kind of a wash in terms of work for me. So I'm very interested in working on projects as either an embedded coach or to training. I do Scrum training and consulting, and I am a software architect too. So anyway, that's it. And any, yeah, sure, sounds good. Yes. I say that, but that's not really true. I've had luck. It's just, it's such a slog. Uh, so it takes, one of the challenges for all coaches is that it takes a while for people to adopt new ideas. And I I have tried a lot of things, but mostly it's working with them and saying, let's decrease the number of metrics you're trying to measure, or let's try to. I actually, with, I seem to have done this with a lot of creative teams for some reason, creative teams that are doing graphics and stuff like that. They're all screwed in this area. I don't know. Maybe it's just like, so you go in and like they're getting requests for graphics from this person and that person and the other person. And there's no one person that's funneling all the stuff. I've seen this 5 times, right? Like it just happens in virtually every creative thing. So what I do is I do some of the systemic stuff. I draw the picture about, well, how does stuff come in? How long does it take? What's the handoff time? All that stuff. And then I look for the big constraint. And usually one of the big issues is that every time they get a new item, it interrupts something that they were working on. And so it extends the time of those things more than the amount of time that you're, because they're doing task switching all the time. So drawing those pictures on the board has been extremely helpful. Not, I was just remembering one person who just didn't want to see this picture, right? Didn't have a lot of executives. They think they're super busy and they don't really have time for you, and you're just an agile coach and you don't want to pay attention. So those are the people that you can't solve. Anybody else you usually can. So my boss at Skype was one of these people who would do a lot of work in process, and I would just come in and just regularly say, hey, let's reduce this, we can get some more done. And he did adopt all those practices. It just took a long time. Other questions? Yes. No, these are totally scalable. Now, the intent of these, I do talk about software a lot, and I apologize for that. And I am a Scrum guy, but I intentionally, if you look at the patterns themselves, there's nothing in there that say it's at the team level. It's actually, they could be giant organizations. So we can think about climate change organizations. That's a really big thing. Like, what's your metric for success? And it would be maybe the number of politicians that are actually voting in favor of climate change initiatives. But there's a huge body of people that contribute to that. So, Oh, this is definitely a team level thing. This is a Scrum thing, but it's informed by the patterns. Yeah. Yeah. So I agree. And so I did talk about it from a developer point of view, but I can go back and I can talk about it from a lean startup point of view. So with lean startup, which is your world, is a different world, right? You're trying to maximize monetary value, long-term monetary value usually, right? So when you're measuring economic progress, it's not velocity and quality and happiness. What you're going to measure is you're going to measure reach, engagement, and monetization. Those kinds of things. Like how many people do we have signed up for our system? Do they how much time do they spend on our site? And how much money do they spend? And so you're going to be looking for leading indicators that will tell you whether your product idea is a good one in that space. And then you're going to apply, so lean startup is build, measure, learn, right? So this is the measure part. And then the build and learn part is really here, right? Like you're actually experimenting, you're trying new ideas, super cheap development projects that just determine whether there's a market there or not. And then you limit work in progress. That's the super cheap part. So the super cheap part is you don't want to spend a gob of time building some super duper awesome thing to test this theory. You actually want to do something really lightweight. And so Scrum can help you because sometimes you get to a more mature product and you actually do need to do some development to really test the theory. But in the early stages of a startup, you don't, right? Like you can just interview your friends, or you can, create a fake website that offers a product for sale, and then people can go to it, and you can measure how many people actually get to the buy it button, even though there's no real product. But that's a classic lean startup sort of thing. The collective responsibility part is now within your product management team. So if you're typical I would say good organizations, product organizations have a lot of people involved in product management, not just a product owner. And so you'll be working with other people, graphics people and other people like that to determine that. And then you have systemic problems too. But now you're analyzing marketing, all the things that you've seen in the pragmatic marketing course, which you might have taken, which says this is what a product manager does. And there's this huge laundry list of sales brochures and all sorts of stuff that they have to do. That is your system. Does that make sense? Okay. Thanks for having me.